Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and we are in the middle of Christminster, and I hope to finish Christminster today. I hope it's not too long for you, but there's so many things that stand out. I'm of course not going to go over every little thing, but I want to give you enough stuff that if you had to write a paper about it, you could really analyze and elaborate on it. Okay, so where I left off, Sue and Jude are with Phillotson. Phillotson comes back in the picture. He was the schoolmaster who left, said, "I'll never forget you, Jude," and then forgets him. And in the beginning, you already see that Jude sort of romanticizes his teacher, his professor. And what he says when he actually sees him, now that he's a little bit older, is that he had a homely complexion. And a lot of times the description sort of fits the personality. There's not a whole lot about Phillotson that's really that interesting. But what is kind of interesting to give us a hint about what kind of person he is, when Jude brings up, you remember you had this scheme, you were going to go to the university, and and Phillotson says, "Well, I'm surprised I told anybody that." And Jude would tell anybody who would listen, right? And Phillotson says, "I think I would keep that in my private counsel." But I abandoned the idea long ago. So look at the difference there between Phillotson and Jude. And it's not that you shouldn't go after your dreams. I'm absolutely a dreamer. But it kind of reminds me of a Kipling poem, the If poem. I used to give this to my students to encourage them because I thought it's just the best poem for students, for anybody really, and anybody who's discouraged, you should look at it, the If poem by Kipling. But in the very beginning, he says, if you can dream and not make dreams your master. And that's very hard to do, because you could waste your entire life on a single dream instead of, living your life for the next 20 years, which is what Jude does. And Phillotson's obviously a more practical guy. He's not going to do that. So he hires Sue, Phillotson does, and it gives you a little hint. He has to work with Sue on arithmetic, and he has to kind of watch her. It's he's sort of like her supervisor. She can't quite, although I think she's just teaching young school children. She's probably far more qualified and could teach college kids if she wanted to, but if she was allowed to, but she's not. And so this is, it's not a bad deal. It's actually kind of good for Sue. But he has to work with her, and I just want to read this one part. While they're working together, they do have to be chaperoned, because for all good reasons, I guess, because what's going to happen. But a little bit of flirtation happens anyways. She's looking at him, she's shy. She would involuntarily glance up with a little inquiring smile at him, as if she assumed that, being the master, he could perceive all that was passing in her brain, right or wrong. Phillotson was not really thinking of arithmetic at all, but of her, in a novel way, which somehow seemed strange to him. So he's looking, of course he's going to have a little crush on her. And the more they work together, the more likely it's going to be. And I don't know that Sue finds him at all attractive. But what is attractive to Sue, and Hardy understood this very well, is that we like to be liked. We like attention. And, I was thinking about this. I don't know that I've ever even said it, because I'm always defending Thomas Hardy. But, when I think about Sue's middle name, Florence, and Florence was Hardy's mistress. Okay, so his wife was still alive when he wrote this book. He didn't come to her with the pages like he normally would. He did that with Florence. But Emma knew that. Emma knew who Florence was. And I hate to say it, but I think you have to be a little narcissistic to give one of your best heroines the middle name of your mistress and not care what your wife thinks about it. Not care that it's going to hurt her. And what's also interesting about Hardy, though, is when she dies, it's a turning point in Hardy's poetry. All of a sudden, he realizes he was so much in love back then, and life was so good. It's a very common narcissistic thing to do. Why? Because you're in love with the phantom and not the reality. And Florence's remarks about the poems, because now he's married to her, and so that's probably very hurtful to her that his poetry is, just obsessed with Emma, who's no longer in his life, very wistfully, wishing he could go back. And she said, well, the poems are fiction. Now, somebody could interpret that as Florence being jealous or just angry, as she rightfully should be. But I think she's actually telling the truth. I think they are fiction. I think they're beautiful, but fiction. Because why would you, if you really felt that way, I mean, we're not talking about C.S. Lewis, who really grieved after his wife died, because he really loved her. Hardy really didn't know what he had when he had it. But he understands infatuation very well. He understands this is the way it is. Later you'll see, I think Jude is quoting a poem from Percy Shelley, one of the Romantics. And Shelley was interested in the question of infatuation. Do I really love these women? Or do I just love to love? And it's a good question. So this is what's happening between Sue and Phillotson. And I think you also kind of get a crush on somebody when you are under them, like the intern or something. And it's a much older man. That could happen. And I don't think she's really thinking it through. But they go on this little adventure with the kids, and they have this replica of Jerusalem. And there's something that happens that's kind of telling about Sue. So they get to it's kind of the field trip, I guess, the exhibition. And Sue's looking at it, and she's not really that impressed. And so she says, that model, as elaborate as it is very imaginary production. How do we even know? How can anybody really pinpoint, the historical, being accurate, with a historical marker, if this is where this happened, this is where that happened. It's not real plausible. And Phillips says, oh, no, researchers have done this, we've got better equipment these days, we can do this. And she doesn't really believe it. And she thinks, well, I think, we've had enough of Jerusalem. And he says, well, it looks like your cousin over there hasn't had enough of Jerusalem. And she sees Jude, who is completely enamored by this and is excited. And he probably looks pretty odd there because he's in his working clothes. You're not going to see a whole lot of working class people go into this type of museum exposition, and yet, he's the one that's the most curious and the most interested and enjoying it. And she calls out his name, and he's Jude startled up from his reverie and saw her. Oh, Sue, he said, with a glad flush of embarrassment. These are your school children, of course. I saw that the schools were admitted in the afternoons, and I thought you might come. But I got so deeply interested that I don't remember where I was. How it carries one back, doesn't it? I could examine it for hours, but I only have a few minutes, unfortunately. I'm in the middle of a job out here. So that's the response, and you see a bit of Sue's sensitivity in this little part, which she's very sensitive throughout the entire book, but you really see it here. Phillotson, just playing around, says, your cousin's so terribly clever that she criticizes it unmercifully, said Phillotson with good-humored satire. She is quite skeptical as to its correctness. No, Mr. Phillotson, I am not, altogether. I hate being called a clever girl. There are too many of that sort now. I know your meaning, said Jude ardently, although he did not. And I think you are quite right. That's a good Jude. I know you believe in me. She impetuously seized his hand and, leaving a reproachful look on the schoolmaster, turned away to Jude. So, she already knows what she's doing here. It's not like Sue's dumb. But it is kind of an impulse that she runs to somebody like Jude in that moment to save her. When you get more of her background, I talked about this a little bit before we actually got to the chapter, just to kind of give you an idea of what Sue was like as a child. She would have been considered nowadays the sensitive child. And when she would go out and play, if the boys even, she's doing something and the boys are actually even encouraging her and clapping for her, and then she says, "Don't get saucy with me," and she runs and they're like, "Oh, come out and play," and she's, "No, never come out," and so she's different, like Jude. And even when he goes back to his aunt and talks about Sue reciting an Edgar Allan Poe poem, The Raven. You probably have read it. And she's, apostrophizing, and the aunt says, "I don't know what she was doing with her hand. She's always looking at something, and you used to do that too when you were a kid." But she's really trying to captivate the audience, and look at who her audience is. I mean, who's Edgar Allan Poe? Sometimes I feel the same way. So they go back, and this is one of these days that is the most dreadful day for any teacher, and that is there's going to be somebody who just pops in and starts evaluating you, and you don't get any notice. And this practically makes her cry and faint, which is exactly the way you want in the middle of a lesson. I remember when the assessment test came out, it was like 2010, changed everything. They no longer wanted you to teach literature. You certainly didn't want me doing what I do. But I think I had 40 walkthroughs that year where people were just constantly coming in the room, sometimes 4 or 5 people coming in. And yeah, I wanted to faint too. I at least got TMJ from it. But anyhow, so that happens, and he has to revive her. And so there's a little connection there. And then Jude is like all excited to go back and meet up with them. And let me show you this. It says, "And as they walked along the wet and deserted lane, Jude saw Phillotson place his arm around the girl's waist, whereupon she gently removed it. But he replaced it, and she let it remain, looking quickly round her with an air of misgiving. She did not look absolutely behind her, and therefore did not see Jude, and sank into the hedge like one struck with a blight. 'Oh, he's too old for her, too old,' cried Jude in a terrible sickness of hopeless, handicapped love." So this is just a huge blow to him, especially since there's never been any kind of hint whatsoever that they would be together or want to be together. But he's already built it up in his mind in a way. He's already imagined her as his wife. He's kept on with this fantasy, and what keeps happening to Jude is he keeps getting hit with reality. And there's only so much more he can take. He's on a very thin thread at this point. So he ends up going and drinking. Oh, the last line of that too is the ironical clinch of that his sorrow was given by the thought that the intimacy between his cousin and the schoolmaster had been brought about entirely by himself. I did this. I'm the one that introduced them. I'm the one that wanted them to work together. Why didn't you think of that? But Jude is also very naive, especially when it comes to people. So he's going to go off and have some drinks. And in the meantime, he had written, he thought, he ran into some guys, and they're talking about Christminster, and one of them is commenting, "When I was there once for an hour, I didn't see much of it in my part. Old crumbling buildings, half church, half almshouse. Not much going on at that. And he says, you're wrong, John. There's a lot going on. He starts romantically talking about, that this is more for the intellectual mind, the spiritual past, all that silence and absence of going in the stillness, infinite motion, the sleep of the spinning top, the harrow of the simile of a well-known writer. It's like if I can borrow the simile of a well-known writer. And he says, oh, well, it may be, it may not be, but it wasn't that big of a deal to me. So everything that Jude is seeing is, of course, he's idolizing, which you very easily could get a question if you're doing this for reasons like AP literature, that we could ask a question about an idolism, an ideal, how it gets you in trouble, kind of like with The Great Gatsby. That was a question. I know they probably won't give the same question, of course, but there's usually some kind of, I don't know, thematic thing that would probably be roughly the same if you just understand the difference. When these guys ask him if he's going to Christminster, did you ever make it? And he says no, and he says, well, how so? And he slaps his pocket. I don't have any money. And he said, yeah, that's what we tried to tell you, basically. Just what we thought. It's not a place for you and me. So, at any rate, he decides he's going to take some action. And he's going to, so frustrated with trying to learn Greek. And Hardy was too, by the way. He's like, if I just could get somebody to help me, to counsel me, advise me, do something, where I can't even go inside. I need help. So he starts to reach out, and he's already been down and out about Sue. He's already had a couple of drinks, and he comes home and he realizes that someone has finally responded, and they've written him a letter. And the letter says that, judging from your description of yourself as a working man, I venture to think you'll do a much better success in life staying in your own sphere and sticking to your trade. Then, adapting another course. That there sure is what I advise you to do. And so this response, this terribly sensible advice exasperated Jude. He had known all that before. He knew it was true. Yet it seemed a hard slap after 10 years of labor, and its effect upon his just now was to make him rise recklessly from the table, and instead of reading as usual, to go downstairs and into the street. He stood at a bar and tossed off 2 or 3 glasses, then unconsciously sauntered along till he came to a spot called the Four Ways in the middle of the city. So, there you have it. He's going to go get drunk. And I like this little passage as he's sitting there at the bar. He is looking around him. It says he began to see that the town life was a book of humanity, infinitely more palpitating, varied, and compendious than the grown life. These struggling men and women before him were the reality of Christminster, though they knew little of Christ or Munster. That was one of the humors of things. The floating population of students and teachers who did not know both in a way were not Christminster in the local sense at all. Okay, and then he gets this urge when he leaves that bar. He goes over to the building, and he has some chalk in his hand. And it says the gates were shut, and by an impulse he took from his pocket the lump of chalk, which as a workman he usually carried there, and wrote along the wall, I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Yea, who knoweth not such things as these. And that comes from the book of Job. which is going to come back around with Jude. In a way, Jude is like Job. I mean, he's blameless. And God says that in the very beginning of the story of Job. He's a great guy. He's a righteous man. You're not going to get to him. And so then he loses his family, and Job's still trying to be patient, but then he gets, incredibly ill. And what's interesting about, just to contextualize this scripture, who is he talking to when he says this? He's talking to his friends who come to comfort him. Now, for the first 7 days, they don't say a word, and they do exactly what a friend should do with that kind of loss, because really, what can you say to somebody who's lost a child, for instance? What are you going to say? I know how you feel, and if you don't, you have no idea what that suffering and that agony is like. So just the friends sitting there in silence is the best thing that they could possibly do, but they end up opening their mouths and start rationalizing all this. Well, maybe it was because your children were sinful. I mean, because why would God do this to you? I mean, there's got to be a reason, right? That, and this is something I've heard too in my life, that, you have this illness because, there must be some sin in your life. And you're like, really? That there are other people, as Jude points out, I mean, Jude and Job probably point out that the wicked seem to be doing just fine, right? And so it's not a good thing to say to someone who's suffering. And even God later on says, no, your friends are wrong. I'm not punishing anybody. And of course you didn't do anything wrong. But what he's saying is, I could go into that college and know just as much as you, but you don't know what I know. You've never been in my shoes. I could get in your shoes, which was actually very difficult for someone like him to do. But the sorrow and the suffering that Jude goes through, in a way, gives him more understanding. It gives him more wisdom than what these people have. So he's saying, I'm not inferior to you. If anything, Jude has a higher spiritual understanding, or at least he should, if he would just allow these things to transcend. But he gets very stubborn about that. And I just wanted to show you this image that Blake did, and this is also referring to the friends. And see the quote that says, "The just upright man is laughed to scorn." This reminds me of the scene that's coming up where Jude, so he's already, had a few drinks, and then he gets this letter, and it's just like one thing after another. So then he ends up in the next chapter reciting the Nicene Creed. Okay? And these people, they know he's down and out, You look at this image and you see, like, those are the friends. Those are the people who are supposed to be comforting. They don't look like they're comforting him, And the wife was saying earlier, why don't you just curse God and die? Hello? He hates you. Everyone hates you. And it's your fault. And what does this guy need right now? He just needs some mercy. He needs some grace. He needs some compassion. And the people at the bar are laughing at him. It's like they're laughing at his dreams. They're getting him to drink more than he should. And they're saying, come on, give us a little of that, church stuff, that Nicene Creed or whatever. And do it in Latin, because that would be really cool. And none of these guys are going to know whether he's doing it in Latin or not. I mean, there are a few who know a little bit about religion, and it's just like a bar scene. You have a lot of people that are disillusioned about life, and probably have a good reason to be there, just like Jude does. He's still blameless, but he makes a terrible mistake doing this, because the creed is, unless you're trying to get into a monastery and someone says you need to recite the creed, it really should just be in the church. And what's also interesting is I usually do not try to find fault in any footnote or anything like that. I'm not that kind of person. But when he starts to sell the creed, and it's in Latin, I noticed the word filioque is there. And there's a part where he's saying the Father and the Son. Well, filioque is and the Son. That was added later. And so when he's saying this and the people are going, we wanted the most historic. We want, that the apostolic. And he says, everybody knows that the Nicene Creed is the most historic. Okay, now from Hardy's point of view, looking at the Catholic religion, that's probably what he means. But the adding of, that the Holy Spirit proceeds by the Father and the Son is part of the reason the Catholic and the Orthodox people are split. Because the main thing is Orthodox people hate change. They don't want to change anything. And that's why it's the most historic. But during the time, the Catholics had to deal with, the West had to deal with this guy named Arius, and Arius was trying to tell everybody that Jesus wasn't the Son of God. And just another little historical footnote, there's a legend that St. Nicholas, the one who's now known as Santa Claus, slapped Arius in the face for saying that Jesus wasn't really the Son of God. It's a legend. Came down from oral tradition. But at any rate, that's why they figured we better add the Son, and we need to emphasize that. And the Orthodox Creed, I know because I say it, does not say filioque. So I know in the footnotes it says that it's the actual Orthodox one, and it's not. So, but it's close. So at any rate, the point being, he shouldn't be saying it at a bar. It's not something you would do. And Jude does realize this after he's already done it. And then he wants to leave and get out of there. And he just doesn't know what to do with himself at this point. So he goes and finds Sue, which is also kind of an awkward thing to do in the middle of the night. And he says, I'm so wicked, Sue. My heart is broken. And I could not bear my life as it was. So I'd been out drinking and blaspheming, or next door to it, and saying holy things, disreputable and idle, bravado words, which ought never to be uttered, but reverently. So he knows what he's done. He knows that you should not take the creed. It would be like making fun of the Lord's Prayer almost, and the people are laughing at him. And they're encouraging this behavior from him. So it kind of shows you it's like getting kicked when you're already down. And so anyway, she takes him in. He wakes up the next morning and realizes, I've got to get out of here. I got to leave. And he doesn't end up going to work. And he decides he needs to go back home for a while. When he gets back home, he does end up talking to someone who says, a clergyman comes over, and he's already walked 20 miles. He's exhausted. He's already sold some things, the last objects that he has. And this minister comes over and tries to encourage him a little bit. And he says, for it is that of a thoughtful and educated man, you might enter the church as a licentiate. And so maybe not a degree, but maybe someone with a license. And in that case, it would be a lesser thing, but it sounds like if you really want to be a priest, now the question is, does he really want to be a priest, or does he really just want a degree? That was the question for a lot of men back then. But he warns him. He says you have to avoid strong drink. And Jude says, well, that would be easy enough if only I had that kind of support. And so he's kind of crushed in this, but there's a little bit of gleam of hope at the end before we get to, or back around at Melchester for part 3. All right, well, thanks for sticking with me. Okay.